Hi, my name is Tessa, I'm a watercolour artist, and I like to paint chaotic and colourful portraits. This video is hopefully going to help explain some of the thought processes and theory behind the bright and unnatural colour palettes that I choose. Now, by no means am I an expert in colour theory, I have no real education in this, and honestly, up until this video, I haven't really thought about the theory behind why I choose the colours I choose. However, there are definitely a couple of simple rules that I follow, which hopefully will give you a bit of insight into how to start making these colour palettes for yourself to use in your own paintings. So before I start, I just want to say thank you for watching, thank you for supporting. If you don't already, please give me a follow or subscribe to my different platforms below if you're interested. These videos are released on Patreon first to my subscribers, and they get a bunch of other perks to say thank you for signing up. So yeah, please do check out those if you don't already. So this video will be broken down into a few different sections. They're not in any particular order, but I will try my best to explain why certain ones are so important. So, we'll be looking at how colour palettes can affect mood and meaning, complementary colours and colour schemes, the importance of value over hue, and my biggest thing to avoid when working with these surreal colours. The first point, mood and meaning, is applicable to any painting really, whether you're using a natural colour palette or an unusual one, but I do think it's slightly more pronounced in the latter. Having said that, what I will say about my own painting style is that it quite often directly contradicts this idea, so do bear that in mind whilst I talk about this. So, for example, blue is often associated with sadness, grief, or a calming effect, so paintings with a blue hue tend to give off this sense. Whereas yellow is associated with warmth and happiness, and often paintings in yellow bring about those emotions. A really simple example of this would be Starry Night and Sunflowers by Van Gogh. Starry Night is peaceful and soothing in a way, whereas Sunflowers is joyful, and the colour 100% contributes to the mood and the impact of them. Then there's also certain mixtures of colours that can mean a certain thing, or have a certain association. The one that always springs to mind for me is green and red because that just looks like Christmas. Same with red and white. So those are some of the colour combinations I avoid just because I can't see past what I associate them with. But in the same way, we can use that to our advantage when we're trying to convey certain things, like blue meaning sad and yellow happy, etc. But, like I said, I often flip these on their head with my paintings. Not always, but sometimes. For example, my staple colour palette is basically blue, pink and yellow, or cyan, magenta and yellow, and that doesn't really have an association other than chaotic, but when I use them in my paintings, I expressly want to convey sadness or depression sometimes. So how does that work? And the answer is that it doesn't completely matter. Colour associations are strong and a really good place to start, but they don't by any means fully dictate the mood of a painting. So for me, while I always keep any associations or particular moods in mind, it doesn't stop me from using a real range of colours in my paintings. Now, in terms of why blue, pink and yellow work well as a colour palette, that brings me on to my next point, and that is complementary colours and colour schemes. So this one leans a little bit more on basic colour theory, so if that isn't something you know much about, then I'd fully suggest checking out a different video on that. But in essence, what we'll be talking about is where on a colour wheel certain colours fall, and how to make sure the colours you're choosing work well together. And this is particularly important when we're using non-natural colours or painting from our imagination, although it does of course still apply if you're trying to do realistic colours. So we need to think about where things sit on the colour wheel relative to each other. So, complementary colours. These sit opposite each other on the colour wheel, like green and magenta or yellow and blue. Picking complementary colours gives you the biggest contrast. However, sometimes choosing directly complementary colours can look a bit harsh because there is such a big contrast. They are never going to be subtle, and you'll likely end up blending them somewhat, which will introduce a third colour into the mix. So that's why I generally wouldn't recommend complementary colour palettes for this sort of work. But it's definitely something to practice with because it's a really good challenge and you'll learn a lot from it. Now onto what I personally use. My most common colour palettes fall into a triadic, a split complementary, or an analogous colour scheme. With triadic palettes, you're choosing 3 colours equally spaced around the colour wheel. So in my case, this tends to be blue, pink and yellow. And I find this works really well if you use one of those colours mostly and then the other two as accents or shadows or highlights. Sometimes I will switch out the pink for a purple. That would make it into a split complementary palette, and I probably lean slightly more towards this in my own work because I think it's a little bit more subtle, but also at the same time kind of jarring. Yeah, to me that kind of just works a bit better. Then analogous palettes. These are one of the easiest colour palettes to work with, for obvious reasons. All the colours mix really nicely together because they are next to each other on the colour wheel. And these palettes don't have to be as distinct as where we have pink, red and yellow. It could effectively be a palette with just different shades of blue, making it monochrome or nearly. So that is why an analogous palette is a great choice if you're just starting out painting in these sorts of unnatural colours. There are also other colour schemes you can work with. You could do a square or a rectangle, but honestly, once you get used to it, you can pick any colours you want and make them work, and you don't really need to think about the theory behind it. I would happily do some examples if you want to give me a set of colours to work with, so do leave a comment or something and I'll try and make that happen. Next, we move on to the importance of value over hue. And I would put this right up there as the most important factor when we're creating with non-natural colours. If you don't get this right, your painting just isn't going to work, it's going to look confused, it's going to be not very clear. And now if you don't know what I mean, I'm talking about how light or dark a colour is. This is value or tone. It essentially doesn't matter what colour or hue we use as long as the value is right. If you turn the saturation down, set it to grayscale, would it still look real? So to show you this, let's look through some of my paintings in my sketchbook. Which ones in grayscale look best to you? For me, it is consistently the ones that have the highest contrast and the greatest range of values. And I think that helps to not make it look flat and kind of dull, even if we are looking at it in grey. I think this one is a really good example because I know lots of people really like this sketch, but to me, I cannot see past the fact that it's just dull. I think this painting shows it really well because we have the realistic colours versus the bright ones, and then once we turn it to grayscale, they do look relatively similar. Everything matches up with the other side. Obviously not exact, but they have very similar values overall. This makes it cohesive and makes it make sense, because if the values are off, the paintings will feel flat. So in essence, it doesn't really matter what colours you're using as long as the lights and darks are right. The final thing I want to talk about is probably the biggest thing that I try to avoid when working with unnatural colours, and that is muddy colours. So this is when you overwork the paint and end up mixing too many pigments. When you layer different colours on top of each other, you get this dulling effect that if it goes too far can end up looking murky, just a bit kind of gross, and results in a kind of weird brown colour. And this is a common problem when a mix doesn't turn out quite how you planned, and you go over it and over it trying to make it better, but end up making it worse. This, I would say, is particularly prominent with these surreal colours, but it does of course apply to any colours you're painting with. By mixing lots of different pigments, you are dulling them down and losing a lot of the clarity and vibrancy they once had. I don't personally find this a massive issue because my painting style is quite loose and doesn't consist of a lot of layers, but if you're trying to blend colours, it's really easy to do, and the solution is just don't overwork it, which is easier said than done. But if you do need to layer, wait till the first layer is dry and avoid using too many colours. Keep it simple. The fewer layers of different colour, the better. So that is a whistle-stop tour of how I choose my colour palettes. As I said, this is just my general thought process. It's kind of unconscious at this point, but like with many things in art, the best way to learn is just to practice. Try different colour palettes and see what you like, see what works for you, and of course look at other people's work. Just a couple of people who I really admire for their colour palettes, Agnes Cecile, of course, Miriam Hoffman, Nick Runge, James Jean. So I will link their Instagram profiles down below. Have a look and just experiment. Working in this sort of style is about trying things, and sometimes they won't work, but that is how you're going to learn. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video and that it was helpful, and see you around.